Praxis at our Praxis group. Marcela Lopes will present building knowledge through uncertainties, controversies, and contingencies. She's an architect and urban planner with a master's and a PhD degree in architecture at UFMG. She's a professor at the Department of Projects of the School of Architecture at UFMG. All the speakers will have about 20 minutes for their presentations, and Jobert will make comments and ask questions to each one of them. And after that, the speakers will answer the participants' questions sent by YouTube chat. Thank you all for your presence. I'll give the floor to Jobert so he can introduce himself and call on the guests. Good afternoon, Denise. Good afternoon, all of those who are following us. There was one thing missing in my presentation, that currently I'm working as a special counselor for housing. So it's the first time we're able to hold this chair. We're discussing public policies. A lot of problems, obviously. To discuss public policies, we need the will to carry out public policies. I'm deeply grateful to be a part of this event today. More than satisfaction, it's a great honor. Our history together with Praxis has been it's been a long history. We've been able to exchange knowledge, and we've had practical wins. We've changed lives through the knowledge that is made available through this group. So I'm going to just have a brief opening, and I would like to give the floor to André Soares and Jerusa Lustosa second. So over to you, André. I don't see you on the video. He is here. Okay. The floor is yours, André. Welcome.
Thank you, Jobert. It's a pleasure to be here in the Praxis event, celebrating over 10 years of the research group that I had the pleasure to be a part of, especially in the early days. During my master's, I had a joint study with all the researchers at the time. It was the start of the dialogues project with Sister Dorothy. After that, I had a study about housing policies in the Minha Casa Minha Vida program. And so I have a presentation that's the result of this path that is very much intimately connected to Praxis. So let me share my screen. Well, today's presentation is based on a study that's still not released. This is a chapter of a book that we're publishing here with the book of the event. And this is something I've been thinking about ever since I entered academia as a professor, and I worked in the construction industry, which is this idea of how do we design? What's designing for? Why is this element of representation of the space so connected to our profession? It's something that's really important to our profession as architects, which is what Praxis does in relation to communities as well, technical assistance. But I have a lot of questions regarding this. What is this relationship between design and communities? I understand, well, with my professional trajectory, that design, at least formally speaking, is the way with which architecture communicates with others. This is where we have the official language, so to speak, of the proposals which architects develop in their work. So if we look at the potential in communication of design, all the discussions that are related to this, the failures, the counterintuitive things, the challenges we have in day-to-day life in constructing spaces, be it throughout time and history, we need to understand a little bit of how the profession relates to society. So now we must teach the architectural design. This is part of the official curriculum. And in my trajectory as a professor, I was always connected to this area because how as a young professor joining the courses, they're the ones who know how to do virtual modeling. We're the ones who know how to deal with these digital tools. And since we're living in an age of constant innovation of these tools, we were always placed in the classes teaching architectural design. And so basically we're doing a criticism here of how this is taught. And as I've been discussing this in praxis and throughout my trajectory as a researcher. And now we have something very important. The first criticism that we have has to do with the relationship between design and the language that we have internally in the field. It's a type of communication that's a little aggressive, violent. It determines, has an approach. Spaces that are created towards based on design, they are very connected to a mercantile realm, and the tool itself works as a way to control construction works, and so that you know how this process goes on based on the design. It becomes a sort of prescription for a construction site in a very mercantile logic, especially when we're producing spaces that will be sold in the real estate market. This is very aggressive, very violent, and we impose divisions, which is the technical constructive knowledge, which is academically recognized, which is urban architecture, and the part that has to do with actually building and construction works. People who are working in construction sites, their knowledge aren't recognized, and they are just as important as architects and planners in the construction process. It's at the construction site that things actually take shape, and the relationships that are created by design in the production line of space, they're constantly violent. So I think this is a very interesting criticism to make, and something that I think it's interesting for us to complement is that design also has a form of violence inside the field itself in relation to those who are learning. The students, when they're starting their architecture courses, design classes are a moment that are, well, they're like a rite of passage. You're placed inside a classroom and you're put there and you have to represent things that are very distant from your reality. So people usually determine a certain stigma for students, those who are able to absorb all of that which is taught in that very abstract and complex way. Those are the people who are saying, "Oh, you have good spatial vision. You're going to be doing well in the other design-based disciplines." And those people who have a certain difficulty, they're going to have their path traced as being a little bit more challenging during the course. They have very mechanical and imposing tools and ways. We don't criticize the tool itself. We know from practical experience that you have a project and you go to a construction site, the relationship that the construction site has with the project, sometimes people don't look at it, sometimes people don't understand it. So the relationship of architecture with other disciplines and with society are very challenging. So this is a communication failure. This is a criticism in relation to communication, and it has a certain impact. And so 85% of the construction works in Brazil do not have architecture specialists. And maybe a little bit of this has to do with this form, this language, the way that we relate to this society as a whole. It goes through this means, this tool. And the strategies for teaching design, it's important to show that we are educating students to reproduce this sort of example. This was an architecture competition. So we're actually just teaching design without having any notion of who we're designing for, without even understanding what the space is going to be used for. So without a place and without a person, we are going over a lot of criticisms and issues that for a long time we've been calling attention to this based on our outreach programs and other activities in the universities. This is not a language that we are able to reach people with, that we can create a consensus and understand these. This is the understanding of praxis. Our dialogue shows this, and other technical consultancy and outreach experiences that we've had really show us this very well. And so we create a type of presentation. This has to do with Carlini Mendes Mendonça, who is an important leader in this area. We're always trying to sell or convince people about a project to a examining board, but that's not what we actually do. Projects are a discussion and exploration, something that needs to be discussed with people who are actually going to make this place work, be it the agents that are going to be there the day-to-day life, or the agents that are going to actually build that during construction. And so when we have this approach that design is the language, we need to have a posture to actually deconstruct these power relations. We have the specialist and the non-technician. All of us, the people who are going to be living in that place once it's actually built, or the people who are going to actually build that, or the people who are planning. The ideal would be that those three environments are related in the production of the space. All of them are agents. And so a space that's needs to have the meeting of these three environments. And so the power relations can't be in this traditional way. We need to invert this logic of imposition when we're teaching the architectural design, identifying that that is a tool, and we need to look at the limits of that way of working based on design and other elements of representation of the space. It's very important for us to think about this for students that are in the process of learning. So the transformation of urban space can't just be the result of specialist professionals. We don't have the control over everything that's going to be in all the people in the communities, the people who are going to live in those places. And we must understand that the process of planning, building, executing, and transforming space must always be it through design or through other ways of communication, must always be open to transformation and insertion of other living experiences. So we must try and incentivize this when we are producing spaces. So be it in the city or be in the construction site, that they be more democratic. And so design, if we look at design, we should teach design that's open to transformation. This is a type of teaching which is interesting. The experience that I'm going to show here is experience, because it also helps with the formation and education of people, both for the classic marketplace, like working in an architecture office or for the state, as well as for people who want to carry out and develop technical assistance in communities. This is all something we're always trying to look at ways of communication that may join all of these different values. So when we look at design as a visual language that's hard, well, it needs to always be open to new proposals and interactions. So we need to incentivize, when we're teaching students, we need to incentivize them to express their spatial ideas in a more free way. They can't just be stuck to the projection rules and other classic rules for design. Other forms must be thought of in education, and we do have huge examples throughout the beginning of the century. We had a lot of different experience of subverting this architectural language to include other people and other visions in the participative process. And another example that we have starts with Sérgio Ferro, Flávio Império, and Rodrigo Lefebvre in the constructive practices that they have in the Isler House. There's a different connection to the work site and cheaper construction materials. You have a certain autonomy so that you can build things in a different orders, giving freedom and having a possibility of self-management by the people on the construction site, and possibilities of changes in the design by during the construction site. So this dynamic of how things are consumed at the time of the event are a sort and a prerequisite, a necessary prerequisite to create people who are able to communicate with the people who are going to live in that place or use that place, and the people who are going to build that place. Another example, which is very interesting, is an example from Praxis, which I think was one of the most important examples. Was the construction of the Tia Carminha childcare. We've been looking at the space with dialogue, learning about it, and we had the chance of monitoring the execution of the construction of the site, and we created new ways to communicate with the people who were there at the construction site, and with constant work of different people who had scholarships or the students who are working monitoring the work. So we have elements that we learn in academia and use them to communicate in a given reality. Something else that I think is very important here is the moment when the construction actually works. That's the place where we actually have the communication. So the relationship with the act of building, that's the moment when the relationship with the communities, especially in urban occupations, is you should have more fluid conversations. If we're coming from academia, we should strive to do that. And finally, one of the groups which I think is the most important in technical assistance and consultancy and are able to keep this practice alive and have an incredible project. These are very wise, interesting women that I had the chance of meeting them, and they were able to help them. This is the architecture in the peripheral areas, architecture in the slums. There are people who transform their own residence, and they have a project which has an original survey of the planning of the construction site with a variety of different informational elements to try and help the communication between the specialist and the non-specialist. And then we have the workshops for carrying out the actual construction work with the help of these specialist women. Mestre de obras, mãe. And so we have the theme that was brought in the discipline. We had the self-constructed house in the Paulo Freire occupation. And this was the house from Margarete Madalena Israel. The project started, we had a person that was the people who would be helping in the design and the execution of the construction site. And so we have this project that leaves this logic where we have a profile of the people who live and a sort of real estate speculation logic. Instead, we're trying to go for practices which are more realistic, discussing reality, and it all starts with an initial visit so that we read that space. We have a lot of different readings, a lot of proposals, a lot of different ways to look at the area of the occupation, political relationships, but relationship to infrastructure. After that, we can come to a conception of a project which is more engaged because we're discussing all this, and we can insert themes to be researched throughout the process of design and representation, which is to make things compatible, defining all the different steps, thinking the construction site step by step. And then this reality was interpreted based on what happened on the field. The technical development, which I think is always a problem in the disciplines, which is this representation, which is excessively technical of architectural design, which is actually something that's very easily done. We're discussing construction. We're discussing the actions which people will take, the people who live there, to actually be able to do this action that architectures do. And finally, we have a work parties, and we plan this, and then we come to this reality. We're able to insert everyone who was involved in all of the steps in construction of the steps. Even if we're following the logic of the design project, we're questioning critically what architecture does inside the semester with the participation of the students, of the communities, and of all the other professionals. Were very patient in receiving us. And so we started to subvert design. It didn't follow the same logic, the same classic client relationships that we see in our classes in university. We're also trying to incentivize, especially when we're teaching design, we're breaking this thing that the architectural project should be just an expression of the individuality of the architecture. This is something that we always incentivize through architecture magazines, etc. Instead, we're thinking about building through the collective. We are part of a collective process. Even if we're producing for the traditional real estate market, we're producing something collectively. Someone else is going to take our work and continue our work. And so I think it's also interesting that the process has a demonstration of a variety of different possibilities of reading a place. I think that students, based on that, can realize that self-construction is very important. The decisions that are made during the process of self-construction have a reality, have a rationality, and have a way of planning. And it's not based on the way that we usually learn this in university. And these work parties, since they happen outside the university and in these communities, I think that this is a great way to do this. You don't need to have an investment in huge investments in experimental work sites where we can actually work on building houses. And so we'll go back to the work sites, contacting the communities and showing how they learn. It shows that this construction knowledge that's in the peripheral areas can transform the university itself. Something that Denise always mentioned a lot in Praxis. She has an article about this, which is very interesting, which is the transformation of the university based on the knowledge of these communities. And I think this is very present when we're discussing civil construction today in this environment. This is it. And now I'd like to open the floor to Jobert or to the next speaker. To the next speaker. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, André, can you hear me? Because I have my headphone on. Thank you for your presentation. I'm already listing some questions here. It was really interesting. So let's go ahead and invite Jerusa. Hi, good afternoon. Let me set up my timer. I am going to follow this presentation. I'm going to share it. Can you see it? Denise has introduced myself. My name is Jerusa, and she's situated where I am. So first, I'd like to thank Denise for the partnership that started off in my MSc when I started in 2009. I finished it up in 2011 when the year my Elena was born, and then I had Cecilia, and a partnership that continued from 2016 through 2019 in my PhD course. So I started off in the beginning of Praxis, and I'd also like to thank my very dear colleagues, especially Ju, who is here also, who was a fundamental partner in my PhD program. And I was thinking about my graduate school, and I noticed that I've always been exploring, like André just talked about. I was exploring the effects of disciplinary knowledge in urban space. So in my master's, I discussed urban legislation and its lack of enforcement. And in my PhD, I reflected on the production of urban space, also thinking about the importance of architectural drawing and design in this discipline. So my idea here, and I didn't say the name of my PhD research, I bring an element of my dissertation and I'm also going to share. So my doctoral dissertation is entitled The Disciplinary Device of Architecture, which I defended in 2020. And I intend to approach two important themes. First, the considerations made regarding the need to reflect on different practices adopted for the link between architecture as a disciplinary knowledge and the built practices outside this discipline, also conceived of as self-construction, and the effects of the bonding between these different practices in the production of urban spaces, i.e. its actual materialization. So the starting point of my research was understanding that there is an unexplored gap in the technical domain which deals with the devices used by architects. Here I'm talking about all of the professionals who work in the production of urban space. So on the one hand, we have the dweller, the self-builder, and on the other hand, the architect, technical knowledge. And my focus was in the processes in between. That is, which devices are activated by the resident and by the architect and how they align or don't align. The argument of my research is that it is necessary to think of a new logic of work so that the resident can trigger the device. And with this, a possibility of transformation in the materiality of the work, thinking about remodeling and building a house. The current logic is that the driver is the architect, and who does not activate what is in fact necessary for materiality. So what I want to say is that the architectural project is not the end of the project. What I'm saying is what is built in the disciplinary knowledge. So from a new logic, the dweller must activate the device. And so the leader of the process is not within the technical role. So we're thinking about funding and materialization. So as a methodological support, I used Foucault's theory. He really brought to me a lot of reflection, thinking about these truths that are crystallized, and how do these truths carry out to the construction. We thought about a knot that needed to be untied, and I had to understand the lines that compose this knot. So one of the concepts that is within the devices for Foucault is discipline and devices. So disciplinary devices that are, this is well developed in my research. These are concepts that are basic in Foucault's research and theory. So devices are discourses, institutions, regulations, that is, the spoken and unspoken strategies that are necessary to delimit and exert the power of a given knowledge area. At the same time, the device is a mechanism of action that, when activated, constructs things and subjects. In this sense, disciplinary devices in architecture address the strategies that support the discipline, mechanisms of action used by the discipline as a tool for the production of urban areas. Architecture as a discipline is understood as that which is operated from the disciplinary devices of architecture. So to better understand this concept, I explore what is knowledge from Foucault's perspective. So we also discuss what is not considered architecture. So as a background is, how do the disciplinary devices in architecture act upon spaces that are built from a practice that is not disciplinary? So I worked on under the law 11AAA of 2008, which is the law of free technical assistance. We have a lot of difficulties in enforcing this legislation, but it's opened an area of action. So we start off from the architectural discourse that builds truths in the discipline, and these disciplinary devices create two discourses, one that is disciplinary, another that isn't. So the disciplinary content has diverse consequences for the production of urban spaces. So we can untie the knot. We have to understand the practice of the self-constructor using a Foucaultian construction, and also the technical discourse. And to see how these two practices aligned. So thinking about self-construction is agents, has as its agency discourses that structure and restructure themselves. So the non-disciplinary architecture is made from what is conceptually referred to as self-construction. The intention of this analysis from a Foucaultian perspective is not to explore the discourse of the narratives themselves, but to understand how the discourse becomes truth and what the effects are on the production of the urban space. Discourse as form, not as content. So there's not a direct relationship with the practice. So self-construction doesn't have a single definition, and its different approaches are constructed from different theoretical narratives. These narratives have overlapped and stimulate a dense concept with multiple possibilities of interpretation, but that distance themselves from the practice of self-building. In this concept are inserted layers of technical, constructive, territorial. So they're not isolated issues, but there's a technical segmentation or territorial segmentation that justify this concept. So this transforms the concept into very dense. So the self-constructor doesn't conceptualize himself as a self-constructor. So I'm bringing in research that started by me, Denise, and Julian. It was necessary to start from the reading of the device itself that the constructor triggers for the materialization and what that puts in action. So this means that different discursive practices also lead to different building practices. So this limitation really hinders the reading of the space for the understanding of practice. So we highlight the conceptual fissures of the concept formation with the possibility of interfering with these constructive practices. So we thought about the possibility of interference in the constructive practices. For example, interfering in territory, time, income, constructive practices, autonomy, agents, and culture. So within the technical practice, I sought a path of an analysis based on a distinction by an author. So for example, here we talk about resistance as a practice, one of advancement, thinking about the practice of political advancements, the promotion of housing, and also post-occupation. We discuss betterment and legalization of the built environment. So I work with betterment of buildings, remodeling, and this is a continuous process which really ties back into the process of the builder. Within the technical group that I was in the government, I researched have very different theoretical and methodological frameworks. So we talk about the connection between different technical groups, the government, academia, nonprofit, and for-profit organizations. For the analysis, I had the distinction based on Larson, who talks about the difference between telos, which is the symbolic intention, and techne, which is the techne, the materialization. The author says that throughout time, the role of architecture has always been linked to the agency of telos and techne. And also there's the presence of sponsor, a patron, or a financier of architecture that who interferes sometimes in the propositions both of telos and techne. So the role was to discuss these mechanisms, the bonding mechanism, thinking about when the dweller connects himself to the technical practice, the symbolic mechanism, the political role of having an architect in the self-construction process, what this represents, the representation mechanisms, the drawing tools, the funding mechanisms, and the mechanisms of materiality, the building site in and of itself. So I built this analysis design. So for example, within the sphere of the government, starting off from the experience with the Office of Housing, they work a lot with representation and less with funding and materiality. So they draw up very detailed plans, but they don't have mechanisms that make materiality viable. Within the academia and working as my own experience as a researcher and outreach worker, we do not have a focus on funding and materiality. So the processes which we materialize were when the resident already had some arrangements for funding, or if they had their own labor or they had their own money. Those who didn't were not able to transform our designs into materiality. So just to highlight that we had different assumptions, it was dialogue based, focusing on materiality. We think again on the need for funding for labor and materials. So thinking about nonprofits has a similar assumptions like academia, but they have a bigger possibility of organizing with a for-profit area, so they are able to access some mechanisms of funding and materiality, but sometimes they don't have as much agency in the symbolic representations. Thinking about the for-profit agencies, I brought some advertisements that they disseminate in social media. So sometimes they are distant from what the architect is usually represented as. So what's highlighted here is the concluded construction, and also very related to the building itself. So local builders are not stimulated here. So these advertisements try to highlight the idea that if you hire labor, you won't have as much problem. So these companies, they focus on small remodeling projects. So they want to gain in scale. So they really want to just do small kits for express remodeling projects. So there's very little work from scratch. They really had, from 2015 on, they had a boom. And because there's an agenda that where it was important to have this technical assistance. So these companies consolidated into the market and made this sustainable business. So here we can see that all of the devices are activated, triggered, but the dweller has less agency. There's more of a focus on funding and the work itself. Maybe the focus is not on the person who really should be aimed at by the legislation that supports free architectural consultancy. Having said that, trying to untie this knot, we think about the essential importance of labor and materials, and I'm including the technical assistance as labor. This really changes the logic. If we think of technical assistance as labor also, it's new logic. And we need, along with this legislation for free technical assistance, we need funding or full subsidies for building materials and the whole process. And to wrap up, if we think about a new logic, we want to really approximate these devices to the resident and not just to the architect. That's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerusa. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to open the floor to Juliana Linhares. Are you there, Juliana? I'm here. Okay, you have the floor. Let me just share my screen. Here we go. Hello, good afternoon. Before I begin, I'd like to thank everyone, especially Denise, for her invitation to be a part of the seminar. And also, I'd like to thank everyone who's here today and thank you all for the partnership. It's an honor to be here celebrating the 10-year celebrations of Praxis. I know Praxis goes way beyond just a research group. It's also something, it has to do with effective relationships. I made a lot of wonderful friends, people like Jerusa, Denise, and lots of others who are not here. And so in these research spaces, we also built great relationships. Well, I'm talking straight from the city of Salvador in Bahia. As Denise has already mentioned, I am now doing my PhD in the graduate program for architecture and urbanism at Federal University of Bahia, and I'm also a professor there. And Praxis in Belo Horizonte, well, they're the place where I started, and I still feel like it's part of the process. And so the text that we produced or are producing for the book, I titled it Thinking and Acting in the City from and with the Margins of Belo Horizonte and Salvador. And we were provoked to think about how our research works critically and in its context, how they unfold throughout time and according to the challenges that we face. Well, to start with my trajectory, I start with project Dialogues, which is the outreach program from Praxis. That's when I met Jobert and a lot of other people, Eliana Silva. We worked at Paulo Freire, Boca do Rio. And in this process, in this program called Diálogos or Dialogues, when I was an undergrad, this brought different critical thinking to my head, different thoughts, and this also reached my master's degree that I did in Praxis together with Denise and Jerusa. I know that Jerusa already mentioned a lot of things, a lot wider sense than I already did, but let's say my research object was based on the action of architects and urban planners with other self-builders, for instance. What were the methodologies that were possible? How to actually make this relationship happen in a way that we could break with authoritarian perspective. And André also mentioned this, some practices that we end up reproducing inside the field of architecture. So we had this formation with a lot of layers in relation to self-construction. Jerusa has already mentioned a little bit of this. We looked at all the different layers that we met, territory, how it is to be in different territories, which articulated different self-construction practices. What are the times that were possible? Who are the agents who participated in this? Was the labor hired or not? What were the resources that were available in the present time? What were the construction techniques, culture, and autonomy? So these are all layers. How do they form in such a way that they produce distinct and plural self-construction practices? And then I had, so this was brought to a lot of different reflections that I had in this practice of architects and urban planners. There was something bothering me very much around the precariousness. Where do we start from in this action? What are the things that we take as assumptions when reading realities and territories, especially in popular territories? So when we're communicating with a lot of different inhabitants, they had different narratives, images, and imaginary things that went way beyond just this image of precariousness. So I'm in Salvador, and I bring something that was bothering me to the PhD. I want to research around this area of something that's popular precariousness, and now I'm facing another dimension, which is racial issues. So we have communities which are popular, precarious, and Black. So 1/3 of the territory is 2/3 of the people live in 1/3 of the territory in Salvador, and these 2/3 that live in this 1/3 are 90% Black. So when we look at the map, this is a map where we can look at the different ZAs, which are the special interest zones. In race, we can see that this is a Black geography, and these Black territories and Black geographies are susceptible to this racialization. That was already something that I've been thinking about in the precarious architecture league. And when I was mentioning violence and resistance, and I'm not talking about violence only in the sense of criminality, I'm also talking about politically imposed violence in these territories. There's a lot of different kinds of resistance. Resistance is a term that the popular movements use in the city of Salvador to talk about transformation practices which happen on the day-to-day life and historically are carried out in these territories. So going a little bit deeper into what I've been researching, starting in Praxis, and with all of these layers that have been adding up to this formation, this formation that has to do with Black, popular, and precarious, these territories and especially homes, they're seen as being precarious. And so based on this logic of opposition to the city as a problem to be eradicated. But since when are they seen as a problem? Because until the middle of the 20th century, these places were just ignored. So what makes it so that these locations and people and lives, when did they start to be considered as urban problems? How did this happen? I'm not going to go too much in depth in here. I'm just going through this very quickly, but I think it's important for us to mention that we have a long path that we walk through inside of this. So when we have interventions, we have the so-called moralist interventions, hygienist interventions, legalist interventions. We have the urbanization and practices in the favelas or Brazilian slums. And so throughout this path, the state is very much present here. And in 2000, in these processes, and in 2004, we have a term which is precarious settlement, and it starts the beginning of the housing policies in Brazil, which are still the current housing policies ever since then. The establishment of this term means that beyond guaranteeing interventions or institutionalizing these locations, they also reinforce stigmatization of these locations and houses and people. So I think this framing of precariousness still needs to be thought about and criticized, because we have these classist, hygienist, and racist ideas behind it. So I'm not saying that precariousness is a term that we need to end with. I just think we need to think about it because it brings some stigmas with it. It's a formation that is very complex. So precariousness is a central operator in the conversation that I've been carrying out in my research, especially based on my reading of Judith Butler. She says that precariousness is not adequately recognized because we are incapable of discerning and naming something in a way that's distanced from normative conditions. What does that mean? We are always acting in a relational way based on a social ontology. We think about things based on a discourse, based on a power, an imagery. And so these norms are there to make lives different, those that can be apprehended or not. So I bring this logic to the territory, bringing it to architecture and urbanism, especially popular in Black territories in the city of Salvador. And also, using Butler's ideas, she proposes that for us to better understand precariousness, we need to understand it as a shared condition in human life. That is, we are born precarious and we need supports for us to be able to develop. So when we don't have the support, especially from the state, our conditions of living are made precarious. We have maximized precariousness. So beyond just being an analytical category, I think that precariousness is a political bet, in the sense that I can start from other perspectives to look at it as a condition that was politically induced, and as a provocation in the sense of letting other narratives and images emerge from inside these realities. So these other images and narratives, I believe they are able to enter in dialogue and also in competition with the images and narratives that are imposed by the official powers. in this research, I also take the margins as a epistemological basis. So I look at, there's a word in Portuguese, marginality means those who are at the margins and are criminals. So we're trying to go beyond this. We have this game of all the themes going inside and outside the state and practices of day-to-day transformation and resistance to these oppressions. I'm inside a group, a study group here in Salvador, which is called Margear. We've been having collective studies, carrying out collective studies to encompass all of these different ways of living and resisting in day-to-day life. So this logic of margins, we're not just trying to go from negativity to positivity, but it's changing the perspective of apprehension of these realities and to take away the norms of the meaning of the field of meanings in relation to precariousness. So I take homes as the starting place, understanding that they are a central element around which these practices of maintenance of life and survival that I've been mentioning, that's where they manifest and articulate in the flow of people's lives. And so starting off from homes, I'm seeking the intelligibility, to lend intelligibility to these processes of life that are seen as being outside of the norms, lives that are not to be grieved, as we say. I have two images here to tell, in the little time that I have, about a few of the research meetings here in Salvador have been mobilizing in terms of our thinking in relation to popular Black housing. I have an image that we produced collectively, which articulates Black women in the city. It articulates with housing because it transposes the modern relationship of between public and private, in the sense that these Black women historically have been in the streets, both producing the city and producing their own housing through their labor. So this meaning, this link between living and working is already disturbs our ways that we think of architecture and the norms that we're based on, the parameters that we start from to be able to act in, but also read and think about the city. I have another image based on history, how history transposes itself to the present, and how the city and housing conform itself historically based on these productions. These images are also bring another element, which is waters and the sea, especially in Salvador, because the sea and waters they transform people's relationships to the city and housing. Lots of women, especially in the neighborhood of Itapuã, these women were washerwomen. They used the Abaeté Lake's waters to be able to make a living, so that they were able to build their houses, and they washed these clothes and circulate around the city. And so this dimension of housing extends to the city. What are the informations and economies that they circulated? So they also had an urban role to play. And finally, I have a word cloud, all of the different practices that are activated so that different worlds and housings are made habitable. So beyond the norms that we have from the field of architecture and urbanism, what are the tactics that are activated? What are the economies that are used, and so that we can be constituted as a field? They have the dimension of matriarchal families, I have the configuration of homes, not as individually, but as a collective, how they articulate and how they circulate different economies and families. And how these practices that join housing with other urban dimensions reinforce our need to break with totalizing dichotomous approaches and thinking about margins. Finally, since our theme today was building knowledge, I was thinking about how we could do this within architecture and urbanism, but also with the inhabitants who build this in the margins and peripheral areas. And urbans are always trying to build this from other locations, which is thinking about how we make cities and acting with those people who are working and effectively building homes in their day-to-day lives. Finally, this plurality of images and narratives that have been a part of my research as it has developed, they also denormatize our field of meanings, which is reinforced day to day in architecture and urbanism. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliana. Now on to Marcela. Here. Yes, I'm here. Hello, everyone. Can I start off? Okay, let's go. I'd also like to thank the fact that I'm here with everyone. Being the last is kind of difficult, but it's great to hear André, Jerusa, Juliana. It reminds us that we're distant. In the case of Juliana, who's away, but we speak the same language. This is really a celebration of affects and knowledge. I'm going to share. I think I can. And also, can everyone see? My title is, like André said, this work was, it's a presentation based on an article that was produced for a celebratory book for the 10 years of Praxis. My approach was to think about this trajectory from my PhD, where I'm always interested in uncertainty, controversy, and contingencies. This process, it starts off with in my PhD program, a reflection. This was, I worked under Denise Morado between 2011 and 2015, and my discomfort used to be related to constructive knowledge and how could they be connected from architectonic practice to knowledge. And I understood that there were two modalities that not necessarily were compatible. They seemed as if they were in a war in a way. So I opted theoretically for Latou's cartography of controversies. And he invites researchers to feed themselves with uncertainties. So these are the uncertainties. The first one, there are no groups, there are no fixed groups, but there is a formation, a dynamic of groups. The second uncertainty is that of mechanisms that are used for the transformation of issues of interest into issues of fact. We think about some facts of absolute, but we forget the whole host of interests that build those facts. The third uncertainty is to discuss the non-humans. So he will consider an agent, an actor, those non-humans, the things, the technicals, the elements of nature will also be a part of this network. The fourth uncertainty is the idea of the actor network, and this relational concept identifiable through his action in the network. It's a relation between actors that are vectorial and that create this network. And the fifth uncertainty is the writing of narratives. It's always a risky activity, but to fight this risk, he invites us to relate to, it's not relativism, but we will relate, we will retell. So I built this cartography of these two practices, those that invite the sciences, the technical knowledges that are able to approximate architectural practices and architectural knowledges, and also especially those practices that invite the dwellers to use and build the architectural objects. So in this cartography, I realized that there were not two antagonic groups with two different discourses, but there were transversalities, connections. Both of the groups, they repeated certain assumptions that seemed to be different, but there was a repetition, a transversality. For example, with the nature of facts, it was a narrative and the discourse that I interpreted as discourse. That architecture to both groups was problem solving, and that both had a pedagogical project in the sense, not in the good sense of pedagogy, but the idea of teaching to the person who does not know. So in relation to what my colleagues said before, the issue of representation, the idea that there is a reality that needs to be represented as two different things. Instead of thinking that representation builds reality, and also these two groups have an actor, an agent that is transversal, the state, the market, that jumbles up these practices that are not necessarily distinctive groups. In my work also, I also find everyday subversive actions, re-existences, these everyday practices that happen despite planning, despite science, because they are everyday actions. They have this subversive character, this survival and inventive character. Finding this handiwork, artesanias, I also wanted to jumble up the specialist knowledge versus lay knowledge. So first, I was interested in constructive practices versus architectonic practices. Here, I'm interested in the knowledge, in the frontier of and jumbling up of these knowledges of technicians and lay people. So I took part in a lot of workshops, in a lot of courses. This was one of the ones that I was offered. This was a course in 2013. It was called Critical cartographies. And we started to analyze the child in urban spaces in a settlement called Eliana Silva, based on an ask from the community. They wanted to have donation of toys, and they wanted to have a place for play and for toys. And they realized children played all over the place. Like Juliana, we were interested in this limit. What is the power and what is precarity? And when we look at the shanty towns, the Brazilian favelas, sometimes we say, oh, there's no leisure there. Usually we're thinking about objects and ways of having fun, but our students were able to see that play was happening, leisure was happening in a manner that wasn't territorialized. And our students were able to observe and also represent. They were able to represent and re-signify the territory without the pretension of romanticization of the difficulties of the territory, but to think about the representation of the territory makes the possibilities that are makes them visible, so that urban design planning can reflect this reality. So in 2016, as a professor at UFMG, as a coordinator, I started an outreach. I started to coordinate an outreach project. There were three projects, one coordinated by me and two by two other professors. So the artisanies of the common, we started to work in a very similar manner inside the area called the Settlement and Occupation Valley. So there are different settlements called Paulo Freire, coordinated by the MLB, and other occupations, Camilo Torres, Orton, Nelson Mandela, Eliana Silva. And why did these two outreach projects meet? Because we noticed there was a false dichotomy, false in terms of the interests and facts, between popular housing versus environmental preservation, as if popular housing projects were a villain, were subtracting from an area of environmental preservation, because we know this is an area that of environmental interest. So we started to build together these two outreach projects, a project that was called Occupation Park. The importance of discourse. How do we name things? It's really important. We were very intentional and provocative because we thought it was possible to think, to hybridize these agendas, to think about a park that was this whole valley, not just as a leftover area that needed to be allotted and slotted off, because we wanted to have urban design, we wanted to have the building and the preservation work together. So it started off as a course, an undergrad course. We have, we call them PFlex. We can have themes for intervention inside undergrad courses. So the students went to map out the territory to understand the relation of the residents with the green. So think about the space of the child, for example, when we talk about leisure, the word preservation, sustainability, how is it practiced? How is it lived, a lived experience? How does it become a result in the day to day? So our students were able to map out the territory. There was not just subtraction from the environment, but there was also a return to the green because there were gardens, and there was also recycling. That was a very important practice. It was an habit of collecting materials, because people were going to reuse or exchanges labor. So we know there's a network of exchange that is ruled by other assumptions. From that starting point, the students were able to build out these guidelines. It was a project, undergrad course, a project-based undergrad course. So they produced their first proposals and attempts of having a hybrid agenda. I don't know if in the whole country, because this is also being transmitted to other areas, but urban occupations are very, very criminalized. So there's a dispute in narratives. The idea invasion, the word invasion is used to criminalize occupations and their dwellers. So we use this inverted word. We use the counter invasion of green. So thinking about the tree canopy, thinking about areas, that meeting areas where meetings already happened, how shared streets, the streets are shared because of the precariousness of streets, because, you know, for example, the streets have a lot of holes, so they make the cars slow down. So we're thinking about paving. What kind of paving was needed? This work then went to an outreach project. The outreach projects was organized and was handed over to the coordination of these settlements. And we generated some brochures for these settlements. And they were very important, including in the negotiations of these settlements with the government. In a competition for ideas in the next year, we invited students to develop proposals. So this competition had as a guiding and ask, we wanted to have a network of many colors. So the brown there are trails that cut across the territory that can be forested, thinking about an amplified park that is mixed up with the city, with the this was a political strategy that we thought about, thinking about trees that are protected. If the trees that are planted are protected by law, it's almost like the urban dwellers are protected by the trees because the trees are protected by law. We use strong words. For example, those who occupy take care, the invasion of the green, an occupied park. So using these words as powerful forces, as the building an imaginary of a landscape of a territory. So in 2018, we were able to execute part of this project that had been idealized with the with the residents, with the coordinator, and also through the agency of contingencies, we were able to establish a partnership with a government office of sewage treatments. We also got donations from a nonprofit and a for-profit organization, and we were able to work on landscaping through, we were obtaining seedlings, we were obtaining, we thought about possible conflicts of planting these seedlings, and then we had the plant of these young trees after we'd had this dynamic. In parallel, I also wanted to bring this activity that took place. We had the donation, this partner company that was a neighbor of the area, they donated a bus. This donation was a part of a demand for a community radio. There was a very participatory project with leadership, with residents, also a lot of work in education and training of youth in the area. There were 3 options. So one of the options was, so we went to this company to see if they were able to donate a container, and they ended up donating a bus. Again, we amplified this idea of the bus. It was going to be stationary. What kind of uses could it host? What kind of activities? We also, throughout an undergraduate course project, we built with the residents what kind of transformation of this bus. They fundraised to be able to build these modifications, and the course ended up with a work party for the remodeling of this bus. So one of the things that really needed to happen was a lateral space that was able to have a projector, to have a screening room. So there was a metal worker that was also specialized in tents. So this was all concluded. The outreach project continued to remodel this bus. It was all transformed. They painted a skyline, some really impactful sentences, and this bus was presented to the community. There were fundraising bazaars. There was a medical clinic that was used. It was used as a medical clinic and several other uses. There were several activities. I chose 2 in 2019, before the pandemic. We had an assessment of our work groups, and then the pandemic hit us. In this perspective, where we were taking stock of what we had been able to carry out, we discussed how much environmental discourse and agenda really entered the movement. And the movement that invited us to have a community cleaning day, because there was a lot of garbage in an area, and that became a public square. There are some challenges. Some of these artisanal solutions are substituted by conventional practices. Sometimes these people, when they make some money, they start changing their more artisanal buildings. They start changing them for more conventional buildings. So, and also there is a demand for asphalt streets. And we talk about the importance of the permeability of the dirt roads. And a lot of times there's this demand for asphalts. So often these artisanal solutions are transformed and substituted. So with this challenge, we produced throughout the pandemic, we organized an ebook, but we also created a game. And it was a game that complexified and questioned and amplified this writing, thinking of cartography as a collective writing process. So this is every person in the exhibition was able to group these words from this image that was created in this exhibition by this artist. We went back to our cartography of controversies, and we built this methodology that was cartographic. So these uncertainties, we started to ask them, we transformed these uncertainties into questions. So what, when, who with. So we started to search for a grammar from which we could produce this collective narrative. This grammar, it allows us to view the controversies, the formation. It allows us to see how things are carried out, the analysis of the possible. It happens within this time, within this amplified time. We observe how the groups are formed, how the narratives spring up, how they become different, how the agents are transformed. We can see these groupings throughout times. We can carry out vertical and horizontal analyses, thinking about the actors that are permanent, those that disappear at a certain point. A cartography is able to give visibility, but that also provokes questions. How did this actor disappear? How did this rupture take place? How does this narrative maintain itself or modify itself? This allowed us to propose dynamic activities from which we were able to form consultant group throughout Brazil. And so we were able to identify these several consultancy practices. And this game is being worked on. It started off in Praxis in the group Housing and Happiness, and we're thinking about the questions. They come from those initial questions: with whom, why, when, where. And so there are arrangements that are carried out by certain people, and these strategies are validated. These strategies are not classified as good or bad from the get-go. They're debated, they're assessed, based on situations and debates by the participant. And then people reach agreements, even if these are transitory, impermanent agreements. And this creates other urban imaginary that we researchers we don't want to be invisible, but we don't want to impose certain technical knowledge or ideological, sociological conceptions, but that these agreements are provoked and are built from an amplification of situations that are ordinary and extraordinary. Well, we started working on a project and it started being a scale model, and we started off with another undergraduate course together with Leticia Nocini, who's not only a student but an activist of MLB. And we're discussing an inventory. We built an inventory, a catalog of projects that give consultancy to urban projects throughout the country. There is a platform that's really amazing that was built throughout the pandemic. We built a table of these practices that the students are filling out. This organization that is being carried out, and there are graphs of these practices. And our undergrad students are sharing and producing, or today, it's happening right now. They're producing games and they're playing in the perspective of producing these cartographic instruments for this amplification of these urban imaginary. I think that's it from me, for us to exchange some ideas.
Well, excellent. Can you hear me? Okay. I have a few thoughts to share, and I'm going to be speaking from another place. Not much as a resident from an occupation or a person who suffers a direct intervention of the activities. The architects from the Praxis group, people who are engaged in transforming reality to improve the lives of the most excluded, the poorest people. So, to a kind of constant mediation. I don't directly suffer this intervention. And I'm also not a technician from the field of architecture. So, I have a few different conceptions and ideas that I like to share. And when you are going to be answering me, I want you to evaluate these ideas. When André and Jerusa presented, a variety of different ideas went through my head, and one of them that's more related to André, when he mentioned that there's this distancing, there's this fencing off of popular participation in the development of a project, or minimum participation or possibility of suggestion by these. Well, I started thinking, well, I see an architect as a person with a very high creative capacity and a technical framework that allows them to join these two things when this enormous creative capacity and a technical framework that lets them transform reality. That's when we have an architecture professional. That's my vision as a layman in architecture. But oftentimes, since I don't understand the technicians. I see architects as being a lot more like artists. And so we have a variety of different problems in Brazil, but one of them is the complete lack of incentive to our children. I'm talking about basic education. This sort of stimulation of creative capacity, it basically doesn't exist. If we are to take a look at the beginning of education, when kids start drawing playfully, that's when their creative capacity is flowering, and even their technical capacity, because kids start developing writing based on drawings. But we don't have this kind of incentive. So our people are educated from an early age to not have a creative capacity. And I think this is a huge problem, a problem for architecture itself, because then we're saying there's no participation of people in relation to an architectural project or the beginning of the transformation or an intervention in the realities that might transform a given reality. So we don't have popular participation, but we don't even have any incentives for that either. So when people turn into adults, there's another issue, because they feel like they are completely removed from that situation. It's the weight of marginalization, which starts at a very young age. When Jerusa also mentions the issue of labor, I think that's even more severe and important, because when we look at the peripheral areas, slums, a huge amount of the labor force in the peripheral areas are connected to civil construction works. People who are actually transforming reality through actually carrying out the construction, they're the people who often use very modern tools in architecture engineering. They're operating extremely modern construction sites with vast resources, but they don't even have their own homes. How many bricklayers are living in occupations and they're trying to fight for a small little piece of land to build a house because they don't have a house? So this is a very tough reality to face, and I think this is a challenge for the architecture of the future. And so I'd like to first and foremost raise this issue for André and Jerusa. I understand this as a challenge, but I want to know from you if you also understand these grave issues in which people are removed from this process ever since they're a kid. Our workers, our labor force is trained to carry out things always for other people. They execute things in a modern way for other social classes who have a lot of resources available, but for themselves, they just do what's possible. They do things based on what their realities, what their salaries enable them to do, and their social reality. So basically, I wanted to know from the two of you, when I'm talking about social reality, I'm going a little bit deeper into the debate that Ju and Marcela brought us, which has to do with class marginalization and race marginalization. So, first and foremost, I'd like to ask a question to André and Jerusa. What are the challenges of an architecture of the future so that this fencing off of participation is minimized or even completely broken, so that the people who actually effectively transform space and reality are protagonists, so that they are protagonists and not mere task, not merely those who fulfill others' tasks. In relation to Juliana, I like to talk about an experience, and I think I don't know how to share a screen here, Let me see. I'm going to try, but I don't think it's going to work. Let me see. Let me try it out. I think it is going to work. Did it work? Yes, it did work. So this picture is a picture that was taken in 2016 in an occupation in Nova Lima, my home city. Here I have a scale model. This model was made by Juliana Linhares. I don't know if you did it by themselves. We never even talked about this, right, Ju? What your participation was in this project. Because in our day-to-day lives, I just thought it was fantastic and I left it there. And so I'd like to know, I'm going to explain to you how this scale model idea came about. When the Juliana Silva occupation was carried out, I actually occupied this together with the residents. I was connected to the MLB. A little bit after that, when the lots were already distributed and the first constructions were taking place, I participated in a meeting and there were some architects there. The Praxis group was already in action. And one of the architects who went there quite a bit was Thiago Castelo Branco. And he brought a scale model that was made in EVA with very well executed dimensions. So it was a model that was very close to this one. And so we had, this is the green area, this is a spring, you can't build here, this is an area that should be used this and that way. And so he explained everything in the scale model. Everything was very well delimited, very well done, and was technically flawless. And I say, wow, this is a huge checkmate. Because when you have a material like this at hand, no one's going to discuss with you whether that occupation is regular or not. Everything that was irregular that we couldn't occupy was already there. The skill model showed us. And so we did the architectural and urbanistic project of the occupation based on technical foundations. And so I asked Denise and Ju to actually make a scale model in relation to Canto do Rio, which is an occupation in Nova Lima. So if you look in this picture, there's a very flat area, which is the soccer field. And then near my left hand, there's another flat area, which is the gym. And then the area that's the opposite of my body, there's a very steep incline towards the river. And right next to that incline, or there were families living there, 20 families living there. So they had to go down the steep, muddy incline to go there. And we call this the Canto do Rio community, or the Riverside community. So in this small strip of land near the soccer field, we could use that to build the popular housing projects and to shelter those families who are living in a very risky situation from mudslides, etc. The mayor's office just wanted to remove families from there, but not give them any housing in return. And based on this model, we presented this to the mayor's office in October 2016. And as soon as we put this model on the table, this called the attention of the 10 secretaries who were there. We had a lot of people there. There were 40 or 50 people occupying the outside of the mayor's office, making a lot of noise. So the mayor called all of the different secretaries, and everyone thought the work was wonderful. No one had the courage to criticize anything. And the mayor just looked at it and said, okay, if there's this possibility, let's bring it to the end and let's do this. And now, of course, there was a lot of struggle. This was 6 years ago. We have 900,000 reais to start the construction, which is the municipal construction fund. This was money that was just laying there since 2009, and now it's legally bonded to the construction of these houses. We have 16 houses, a few solo families. There's 2 solo families, in which the people died. And so now we have 16 families. And I see this as a very important tactic for us to really bring in and be able to play a checkmate against the public power. Because as Juliana mentioned, she's living a very acute experience of marginalization in the state of Bahia. Here in Brazil, after the abolition of slavery, we have the expulsion of Black people from the urban centers to peripheral areas in slums. So it seems to me like our people are now being kicked out of peripheral areas, no matter to where, because cities are constantly expanding and urbanizing, and so there's no space for poor people in these urbanization process. They just need to be kicked out because the real estate projects don't care about them. They just want them out of there. And so the impression that we get is that the fight in the peripheral areas is great, just is huge, just because they're trying to maintain the places where they already live. They want to remain in the places that they're living in, and we're using a lot of different tactics. And so this thing that Marcela mentioned was magnificent. It was extremely interesting. Just the quantity of different tactics that were very clear that should be used in relation to narrative disputes. And so these people, they say, oh, those people come in and they clear all the forest, and so let's reforest. Oh, they're affecting the springs, and so let's preserve the springs. And now they're saying, oh, they're really disorganized, they don't have anything. And now they say, oh, they even have buses. So all of these areas, I think, are very important so that we have narrative disputes, so that we can, of course, when we win a narrative dispute, we win debates and we consolidate ourselves and we stay where we are. If we lose the narrative, then we're just fighting for survival, even bodily, physical fighting. It's sometimes you might have to fight for your life. So we need to be fighting in relation to the narratives, because after that it's just chaos. And so I'd like to ask the following question to Ju and Marcela. From this tactical point of view, and from a practical point of view as well, what are the challenges of future architecture so that our people are respected and have their rights respected, and public policies are actually implemented? Because we often have demands, resources. I'm from a city called Nova Lima. It's a city in which there's 1 billion reais a year in taxes, a city with less than 100,000 inhabitants. It's the largest per capita tax raised in the country. It's a very wealthy town then. But 1/3 of the inhabitants of the city, 1/3 of the 100,000, are the people who live in private condos, gated communities, and they don't depend on the public power for anything. They don't use the public health structure, the health garbage structure. So we're talking about 1 billion in tax raised every year for 65,000 people to actually use. And there's no housing policy. They don't build a single popular house here for over 7 years now. So we need to name the people who are doing this. We need to use the techniques to actually subvert politics. So this is what I wanted to bring to you, and I'd like to thank you all for your contribution. And for me as a layman, it's extremely great to be able to participate. Thank you, Jobert. Let me just interfere and ask Ju and Marcela to open their cameras, and then we can start with André Dubois answering Jobert's question. And
I'm going to try to be clear and citing your talk just to make it clearer. We're having an academic presentation. Sometimes sometimes we're not clear because we're using, terminology that is specific to academia. So the scale model that you showed by Praxis that you took to a meeting at City Hall, Thiago Castelo Branco uses that when he worked with Dandara. In the sphere of urban planning, these languages are well worked. So you put a scale model on the table, you show how, for example, we're decreasing environmental impact. So a scale model is a graphic element. For each project, we have a model, but for who are we using a scale model? For a group of dwellers and for a group of government officials? What are the intentions of this scale model? So what is created when discussing something? This is a media that is understood by everyone, and the issues are made evident. There, there's no norm or technique or one side that's conflicting. Everyone will understand. So we'll see that, so we can understand, for example, we shouldn't be relocating people if there's space to build. So this comes from something that's really important to highlight is language. And one thing we have to understand is that this language of architecture, of the architectonic drawing of scale models, this is always evolving, especially after we started using digital media. And the tendency is for this language to evolve is either it becomes more codified, either it becomes, there's a line of architecture that defends this, that you need to be highly specialized to be able to manipulate this media, and it becomes a very segregated area where some of these languages are used. There's a struggle in languages when the language is monopolized to impose something. Technique becomes an imposition that excludes, which is the tendency of urban design. That's what you're talking about. The peripheral areas are resistance areas in a day-to-day scale. And the future of architecture, instead of being, something that evolves in its language, is something that involves in communication, where we're able to discuss the problems of construction. So when we talk about drawing itself, is how are these buildings built? Because, for example, if an occupation has the right to exist, the houses will reflect the life of these people. How will these houses exist? How will they access infrastructure? How will they impact the environment? How will the promise not to impact the environment be carried out? So we see a lot of, the outreach programs and the universities. We're generating this information and knowledge. We've been generating this for a long time. It's very valuable. It's a knowledge that
it's not inserted or valued within the very dynamics And so if you teach someone who is starting the architecture course that the very premise for that person is not to be in a magazine, is not to make this spectacular form, but rather to communicate with people about what's going on in relation to an urban occupation or a home, I think that we already have a promising future. I think we're training professionals who are connected to the struggles in the city's territories, urban disputes, which allow for other forms. So we have games, as you mentions, the people's reports of their daily lives and other ways of self-expression. And all of these are ways to express yourself about space. We can't just be open to our own communication. We need to understand communication, how they read their territories and how people write their own territories, because production of space is being done constantly. And it doesn't matter whether you have technical monitoring. If we want to actually help them and consult with them, we need to understand these languages and communications, and we're very far from this currently. So this demands a certain flexibility in our language. It's not just design that's good enough to represent space. We have scale models, we have reports, we have trees being planted, a movement that's occupying a place as its territory and then moves to another one. So this needs to enter the language of architecture. We shouldn't just wait for us to just have our own language and reality to have another language. I don't know if I answered your question, but your example is very clear to me. I think this is very evident for me. Okay, Jerusa, go ahead. I think Jobert also mentioned in his question to Juliana this political role of architecture when he mentions the scale model that he brings to the mayor's office, and this legitimizes this occupation from the community. So these tools that architecture has also are political tools. So that's one side of the story. But about Jobert's question in relation to the future architecture, what I understand is that you're talking about an architecture which is an indisciplinary architecture, not a production architecture, which is reproduced in day-to-day life, but in the disciplinary field and not in the self-construction field. If we're thinking about the things that I research, I would say that this is an architecture that should make sense to everyone. It should make sense to disciplinary knowledge, but also to residents and self-builders. So we need to have a participation of everyone involved so that things are materialized, the production of the urban space in accordance with everyone's desires and wishes. So I would say that it was an architecture that needs to stop thinking only about projects and plans and this political narrative of these tools and comes closer to the territories. We need to skip this middle ground. So we need to go closer with the architect and the territory in such a way that it makes sense for transformation to happen. So I think that for me, it would be this other logic, new arrangements and new ways of acting so that we can materialize this. We would need to change our training, our curricula, the way that we think about architecture. And so Marcel and Ju brought examples that are exactly, and Praxis also does this, practices that change this logic so that it makes sense for people. I think that's it, briefly speaking. Ju, go ahead. I think that what André Jerusa already mentioned, I completely agree with. I also like to mention the dimension of scale. I think the time that we worked together was a time of mutual learning and mutual inspiration, because you brought a reality, a one-to-one scale to an object, a smaller object that is the scale model, so that we have an easier dialogue. This is already a process of change in the logic of thinking. And then after that, the materialization of this process of change also allows us to think jointly. So we started, me and other people at Praxis here, we developed the scale model. We brought this to a dialogue so that we could find collectively. We didn't have a ready-made answer. We had to find collectively the possibilities of articulating politics and technique. So we build different possibilities. Antonio says that we need to fight with the enemy's weapons. So we need to dispute narratives. We also need dispute narratives. So oral histories and conversations should also reach these spaces, but we should also struggle for these technical elements. We should also have the dispute so that we can mobilize this political game. So they had no arguments against this. So in a certain way, this narrative led to a response that they weren't expecting when you brought the scale model to the mayor's office. I had also written down in relation about what Du Bois mentioned in relation to language, but I already feel very satisfied by what he mentioned. So it's important for us to think about how the story from 2016 is still so current. Jerusa mentioned this study in the community. We used other kinds of models so that we could make these dialogues take place and find other solutions, and also have this technical dispute of these formations, these materialities, these houses which already exist and which are technically represented there. So we are architects that are politically have a political position. So I think that's the most important point. Thank Marcela. Okay, let's go ahead. I actually wrote down the other question, the first question, which Jobert asked us to Jerusa and Du Bois. I'm not going to complete it because I think what they mentioned was already very well. And the question that I asked here was, what were the challenges so that people are respected and public policies are implemented? I think that when we're talking about the people being respected, we have this story that you mentioned about narrative dispute that we mentioned so many times. But I think that we have a narrative that's to the outside, and there's a narrative to the inside of these occupations, villages, favelas, slums. The narrative to the outside, we do this as professors together with our students, and we have this sort of dialogue with negotiations with the public power and seminars and congresses, which is bringing the sense of legitimacy, citing names, talking about the validity and legitimacy of those people living there, being there, and not being seen merely as invaders, predators, and so on and so forth, and playing with these narratives, trying to bring visibility to this production of the space that takes place in day-to-day life and that has 1,000 different problems, but there's also brings 1,000 different types of knowledge. So this is the communication to the outside. And something else that also has very important for us is this communication to the inside, because we in Academy, we see this artisanal practices to other directives. The urbanistic directives that we know so far aren't necessarily good. The formal city shouldn't just be repeated integrally in the case of villages, favelas, slums, and self-constructed territories. There's other possibilities that we could expand. It's the imagination of the residents and of the self-builders that are also crystallized in this formal city modus operandi. So there's an issue of giving visibility and positivity to this kind of practice, but we also need to look to the inside to look at what they've already done. I did this because this is not what I didn't do good because that's what was available. No, it was something good. So I think this sort of self-respect or the sort of respect goes to the outside and the inside. And so this goes to the imaginations and the representations that are in the people's heads. And this goes through everyone, including the people living in these communities, the public power, students, and everyone, etc. So this narrative dispute, so that this is fundamental, but it can't just turn into empty rhetoric. And so I think your second question about public policies is extremely important, because as Jerusa mentioned in her diagrams, we have something related to discourse, but also resources. We need to be in the struggle for resources. Self-construction being synonymous to self-financing is cruel. We need resources for people. We need financing. And then public policies need to be implemented, but also expanded, not just implemented in that same old model that we already know, that's impregnated in the imagination of many people and in the role of possibilities that public power has. And so in the board of directors of housing board of directors in Nova Lima and in Belo Horizonte, I joined that. So we need to also fight for money. So seeing self-construction and self-financing is cruel and perverse. It's terrible. We want all the knowledge from self-builders, the resistances, and the artisanal knowledge, but the state needs to come in with the resources, and these public policies need to be implemented to finance this kind of knowledge and this kind of production. So the public policies don't need to just be implemented. We need to expand it, and we need to go into these participatory spaces and implementation spaces of these kinds of public policies so that it also is porous, so to speak, in relation to what is going on and the good things that are going on. I think that's it, Jobert.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to read a question. There's a question from the YouTube chat for André. Renata Salas is asking for André. I see that a lot of students come in with knowledge of software, but they have difficulty thinking about the working with drawings by hand. Are they having difficulty with hand drawing? And is this difficulty also, does this also make it difficult for their for reading the territory? Oh, I'm sorry, my neighbor was honking his horn. I'm sorry. I think we have an issue at the moment that is kind of cloudy with relationship with software. I'm going to talk about my experience as a teacher. We're talking about during the pandemic, the remote teaching, the computer became everything, and all the courses that I taught remotely, that there is much more of an institutionalized time, institutionalized teaching is less flexible. There's a lot of content, norms, rules, everything is monitored, and I really felt the lack of hand drawing, of people registering ideas, discussions, etc. I don't see the digital media and tools as barriers. The problem is not that. The problem is how it's used. In the same way that I could ask, if you're going to be an architect and an urban design, how are you going to use your knowledge? How do you opt to decide on your interests? So I see these tools as these digital tools as positive. However, I see a lack of domain, of expertise. I see them more as they've been used as illustration much more than as a procedure. If you're trying to construct, you have to use the technical and digital tools so that your proposal that you're taking in a community to a client, that this drawing is constantly altered with the feedback you receive. The form through which you draw from the ideas. One of the examples that I cited is the drawing. For example, the way that the digital design was used for that daycare I mentioned. It was digital tools that were used. It was, so a digital tool was used, a software that's specialized, but it was used to form a language that was understood by the people who were executing the word. There was a procedure that was collective. It was aimed at the people who work building in a conception that had been agreed upon. So there's technical expertise, and it's not just presented. When we read the chapter that came out of that, it's a process it's decodified, the structural process that is presented in an accessible way for the community. It does require a knowledge, expertise of the software, but you don't arrive with a predetermined model to the community. You arrive to the community with a question. That's what I see. The tool is just a tool. How you use it in the classroom is interesting. And people are really undervaluing hand drawing. That's silly. What I really feel with the students is the intentionality of the projects, what they see as the space. That the problem is people think that software is everything. That's what I see in the classroom. I hope I've answered your question, and you can contact me otherwise. Okay, André, I have one more question. This question is for Juliana. It comes from the YouTube chat from Marina Sandes. Marina asks, in this exercise of trying to deconstruct dominant narratives, are you faced with definitions of the formal city by the dwellers of the territories that are self-built? How do these dwellers define us as professionals? And how do they define the city that excludes them? And how do these frontiers are described by them? Thank you, Jobert, for this question, for reading this question. I'm sure this question would be a really good PhD dissertation. There's a lot in it. But I'd like to start answering it by saying that our field is not, it has a lot of, it's questionable. It's questionable. I don't see it so much as one side and the other side. We do have people who come from the peripheral areas, who are Black, who are residents of shanty towns, who are being trained as architects, even though they're still a minority. So they are provoking the academy. So I wanted to say that last week I was in a forum, the second forum for public consultancy in the Northeast. There was a representative of the public, of the government, who was talking about technical consultancy. Her discourse was it came to me, I was very uncomfortable with her discourse, because she was saying this program would revert the lack of quality of the housing, that this housing needed to be all the housing needed to be remodeled, everything would be more comfortable. It was a discourse of a lot of stigma. It came very heavily, it was very heavy on the idea that this area, all of the popular constructions were the bad. So after she spoke, 6 representatives of the popular movements came and questioned her talk. Why were they all white men and women who lived in elite areas, who were white, who were the elite, who wanted to adapt territories in norms that are from another place? So I don't know if this answers your question, but I try to amplify your question. I bring tension. I think we're not protected from these questions. I think we're always being shaken up in this idea of one side and the other. We're not as close. I'm talking about the area of architecture, of urban design. This city, which excludes, this city also questions and is questioned and provoked. This is excellent. When I saw the question, it's complex. And I saw myself several times as an activist who is not a part of the area. We have a sensibility, and we understand that we feel a bit like ETs. I've felt like that several times, but because of my sensibility. And when I saw this question, I thought, wow, this would need another whole seminar. I want to give you the word, Denise, and I'm closing my participation. I'm thanking you so much for the invitation. Jobert, this was an amazing afternoon, very pleasant. Please don't run away. I wanted to have a picture because our pictures have been recently of everyone in their little corner, virtual corner. I'd like to say 2 things in relation to Marina Sandes' question. It's a very complex, necessary, huge question. Praxis, under my advice, we're working with Daniele Cunha. I hope she's watching us today. But Daniele Cunha's research question, yes, goes along these lines. I hope we have this reflection to share in a mature form. Of course, not a complete answer, but a mature reflection due to the time that we've worked with the consultants. The other comment I wanted to make was in terms of public policies and the dispute for funding that Marcela mentioned, really reminded me of Sergio Ferro's text work and his counterpoint presented by Chico de Oliveira, faced with self-construction, one for and one against. I think the issue of the dispute between those two, the knot of this dispute, is exactly the issue of funding, but in the sense that we have to understand that this dispute for funding and the construction of public policies, it will only be possible if the self-builders are able to participate in their decision-making process. If the state builds, if the state limits self-construction, the rhythm of work, how long they have to take, the construction models, then you have the state institutionalizing and constraining self-construction. So the dispute for funding is an issue, but the support by the government, by the state, where the self-constructor, the self-builder is an agent, is a protagonist, because otherwise if you hand out money and you absolutely limit how the body is used, because this is a labor of the body, this is problematic. We've talked about this several times at Praxis with people that have the argument that you can't be favorable to self-construction, but this is really what conducted us in our article on self-construction. In self-construction, there are several different kinds of self-construction. And there's sometimes a self-construction that is institutionalized and limited by the state. So I just wanted to bring this new issue of the argument brought by Marcela. We don't have any more questions, so I'd like to close off the discussion. I'd really like to thank you all for your generosity in being here, and the generosity of Jobert of being involved, of participating, as he has done for so many years. I don't even remember how many years we've been working and developing possibilities and discussing, and that is what makes our partnership possible. That's what builds our partnerships and makes them so good. We are building a network of affect, not just of knowledge. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for everyone who is listening to us through YouTube. Reminding everyone that we're back next Monday for our 4th day of our webinar. The complete program is on our website and also through our channel. Thank you. I will ask Flavio to end transmission.